You think you're cold. Try farming through a chill that locks rivers solid and starves the soil. Yet the people everyone counted out medieval peasants outsmarted the freeze with brains, teamwork, and a toolbox of earth-first tricks. Start with the quiet revolution under your boots. 3-field rotation. 1 field wheat or rye, 1 field barley, oats, or legumes, and 1 left fallow to breathe. You're not just planting, you're scheduling soil recovery, spreading risk, and staggering harvests, so a bad season doesn't knock you flat. Spring green in 1 plot, light summer gold in another, and the resting third, pulling in dew and dung, building strength. It's crop choreography. And it buys you resilience when the sky turns mean. None of that matters if your plow quits at the first patch of heavy clay. Enter the game changer, the heavy plow, with its iron share, coulter, and curved mold. You lean into the traces. The sod heaves. The furrow flips clean as a page turn. Those deep northern soils finally open up, straight lines marching to the horizon, water shedding into neat channels instead of pooling into muck. You can feel the land answering less drag, more bite, and rows that actually breathe. Suddenly the village isn't fighting the ground. It's in conversation with it. Water is the next boss battle, and you don't win it with prayers alone. Ditches comb the fields like careful fingers, hedgerows slow the wind, and a mill race hums beside a timber wheel that crushes grain, sharpens iron, and lifts buckets with patient muscle. You track the stream's moods, pulling sluice boards at dawn, letting the channels sip and not gulp. When thaw swells the banks, you guide the excess towards spill meadows that drink it up, then pay you back in thick, sweet hay. The wheel turns day and nighter. Steady heartbeat. You can hear from the lane. Food for soil as much as for people. That's the rule. Manure gets stacked and turned with ash and kitchen scraps until steam ghosts off the heap on frosty mornings. You fork it into the furrows and the earth sighs. Crumbly, dark, alive. Ash adds a whisper of minerals. Compost tames the sharpness. And the field answers with stronger stalks and fewer weak patches. You aren't feeding plants. You're feeding the village's biggest mouth, the soil. And when everything else is lean, that quiet banquet is what keeps you standing. No one farms alone, not when winter bites. Open fields knit the village together, long unfenced strips, common timings, shared tools, and a calendar scratched into memory. You and your neighbors walk the bounds, argue a little, agree a lot, and put shoulder to plow when an ox team falters. Harvest sweeps like a tide across the landscapes, scythes flashing, carts groaning, laughter rolling over the stubble. The reward isn't just grain in a bin. It's knowing no one's left behind because everyone's work is braided into the same rope. Look closer at the beds and you'll see quiet alliances. Tall stalks offer scaffolds, low growers shade roots, herbs perfume the air and confuse marauders. Beans climb, peas fix invisible treasure underground, and onions sit like little sentries between rows. It isn't magic, it's pattern. You tuck flavor beside shelter, shade beside thirst, roots beside feeders, at different depths. When wind knifes across the parish, a hedge breaks it. When a frost threatens, a vine canopy buys you time. It's a garden that thinks. Animals don't stand at the edge. They're part of the circuit. Sheep crop the aftermath and leave small gold behind. Pigs nose through fallen acorns and plow with their snouts where iron can't. Cattle tread down the rough and haul the heavy, then pay the field back in warmth and dung. You rotate them through stubble and meadow, never overstaying in one place, always closing the loop. Meat, milk, hides, wool, traction, fertilizer. Every hoofprint is a ledger entry. Every season a balance sheet. Eyes up. The sky speaks, if you learn the dialect. A halo around the moon. High mare's tails. A run of hard dawn's notes. On a weather staff older than you are. You count saint days and cross quarter times. Feel the soil with your bare hand. And listen to the wind off the fen. Calendars are bones, but instinct is muscle. You sow when the earth gives back a little warmth. You cut before a string of wet days, and you bring the last sheaves under thatch just ahead of the howl. Luck favors the prepared, and your almanac is written in clouds, and gut.seed is a story, not a commodity. You save the heads that stood straight in a gale, the grains that filled well even in a stingy season. You dry winnow, whisper the year into each sack. When doubt creeps in, you walk to the monastery. Behind cold stone and warm kitchens, brothers keep jars labeled in steady hands. Rye that shrugged off damp, barley that finished early, beans that didn't sulk. They test, record, swap, lend. You don't need a library card. You bring respect and a promise to return something better. The fields outside those walls are quiet test beds. And the village eats because someone cared enough to count dot. And when the small thieves come, and they always do, you meet cunning with cunning. Birds wheel at the field edge until a child claps and a bell tinkles from a line. You plant a sacrifice row to lure jaws away from your best. Draw insects to flowers that host their enemies. And time your sowing so a hatch meets empty plates. Hedge and ditch break up pest highways. And rotation pulls the rug out from under anything that expects the same feast in the same place twice. You don't declare war. You play chess. A trap crop here. A herbal border there. A day's delay that saves a month of grief. This is how people with nothing keep everything that matters. Not by brute force, but by rhythm. Land resting and waking. Iron biting and lifting. Water arriving and leaving. Waste becoming wealth. Hands multiplying effort. Plants sheltering plants. Hooves closing loops. Eyes reading the sky. Seed remembering. And clever little countermeasures keeping the larder safe. Winter can snarl all it likes. You've already taught the ground how to answer back. You think you're cold? Try farming through a chill that locks rivers solid and starves the soil. Yet the people everyone counted out, medieval peasants, outsmarted the freeze with brains, teamwork, and a toolbox of earth-first tricks. Start with the quiet revolution under your boots. 3-field rotation. 1 field wheat or rye. 1 field barley, oats, or legumes. And 1 left fallow to breathe. You're not just planting, you're scheduling soil recovery. Spreading risk and staggering harvests, so a bad season doesn't knock you flat. Spring green in 1 plot, light summer gold in another, and the resting third, pulling in dew and dung, building strength. It's crop choreography. And it buys you resilience when the sky turns mean. None of that matters if your plow quits at the first patch of heavy clay. Enter the game changer, the heavy plow, with its iron share, coulter, and curved mold. You lean into the traces. The sod heaves. The furrow flips clean as a page turn. Those deep northern soils finally open up, straight lines marching to the horizon, water shedding into neat channels instead of pooling into muck. You can feel the land answering less drag, more bite, and rows that actually breathe. Suddenly the village isn't fighting the ground, it's in conversation with it. Water is the next boss battle, and you don't win it with prayers alone. Ditches comb the fields like careful fingers, hedgerows slow the wind, and a mill race hums beside a timber wheel that crushes grain, sharpens iron, and lifts buckets with patient muscle. You track the stream's moods, pulling sluice boards at dawn, letting the channels sip and not gulp. When thaw swells the banks, you guide the excess towards spill meadows that drink it up, then pay you back in thick, sweet hay. The wheel turns day and nighter. Steady heartbeat. You can hear from the lane. Food for soil as much as for people. That's the rule. Manure gets stacked and turned with ash and kitchen scraps until steam ghosts off the heap on frosty mornings. You fork it into the furrows and the earth sighs. Crumbly, dark, alive. Ash adds a whisper of minerals. Compost tames the sharpness. And the field answers with stronger stalks and fewer weak patches. You aren't feeding plants. You're feeding the village's biggest mouth. The soil. And when everything else is lean, that quiet banquet is what keeps you standing. No one farms alone. Not when winter bites. Open fields knit the village together, long unfenced strips. Common timings, shared tools, and a calendar scratched into memory. You and your neighbors walk the bounds, argue a little, agree a lot, and put shoulder to plow when an ox team falters. Harvest sweeps like a tide across the landscapes, scythes flashing, carts groaning, laughter rolling over the stubble. The reward isn't just grain in a bin. It's knowing no one's left behind because everyone's work is braided into the same rope. Look closer at the beds and you'll see quiet alliances. Tall stalks offer scaffolds, low growers shade roots, herbs perfume the air and confuse marauders. Beans climb, peas fix invisible treasure underground, and onions sit like little sentries between rows. It isn't magic, it's pattern. You tuck flavor beside shelter, shade beside thirst, roots beside feeders, at different depths. When wind knifes across the parish, a hedge breaks it. When a frost threatens, a vine canopy buys you time. It's a garden that thinks. Animals don't stand at the edge. They're part of the circuit. Sheep crop the aftermath and leave small gold behind. Pigs nose through fallen acorns and plow with their snouts where iron can't. Cattle tread down the rough and haul the heavy. Then pay the field back in warmth and dung. You rotate them through stubble and meadow, never overstaying in one place, always closing the loop. Meat, milk, hides, wool, traction, fertilizer. Every hoofprint is a ledger entry. Every season a balance sheet. Eyes up. The sky speaks, if you learn the dialect. A halo around the moon, high mare's tails, a run of hard dance notes, on a weather staff older than you are. You count saint days and cross quarter times. Feel the soil with your bare hand, and listen to the wind off the fen. Calendars are bones, but instinct is muscle. Use so when the earth gives back a little warmth. You cut before a string of wet days, and you bring the last sheaves under thatch just ahead of the howl. Luck favors the prepared, and your almanac is written in clouds, and gut. Seed is a story, not a commodity. You save the heads that stood straight in a gale, the grains that filled well even in a stingy season. You dry, winnow, whispered the year into each sack. When doubt creeps in, you walk to the monastery, behind cold stone and warm kitchens. Brothers, keep jars labeled in steady hands, rye that shrugged off damp, barley that finished early, beans that didn't sulk. They test, record, swap, lend. You don't need a library card. You bring respect and a promise to return something better. The fields outside those walls are quiet test beds, and the village eats because someone cared enough to count. And when the small thieves command, they always do. You meet cunning with cunning. Birds wheel at the field edge until a child claps and a bell tinkles from a line. You plant a sacrifice row to lure jaws away from your best. Draw insects to flowers that host their enemies. And time your sowing so a hatch meets empty plates. Hedge and ditch break up pest highways, and rotation pulls the rug out from under anything that expects the same feast in the same place twice. You don't declare war. You play chess. A trap crop here, a herbal border there, a day's delay that saves a month of grief. This is how people with nothing keep everything that matters. Not by brute force, but by rhythm. Land resting and waking. Iron biting and lifting. Water arriving and leaving. Waste becoming wealth. Hands multiplying effort. Plants sheltering. Plants' hooves closing loops. Eyes reading the sky. Seed remembering. And clever little countermeasures keeping the larder safe. Winter can snarl all it likes. You've already taught the ground how to answer back. But fertile earth doesn't stay that way by accident. Every handful of soil you take must be paid back. And medieval peasants knew the currency: manure, ash, compost, and patience. They piled animal dung with kitchen scraps, weeds, and fireplace ash, until the heap steamed in the cold air like a living thing. When you spread that dark, crumbling mix into furrows, the ground almost sighed with relief. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was genius. Waste became wealth. Decay became promise. Ash added minerals, manure built structure, and every layer of compost stitched fertility back into tired fields. Nothing was wasted. Even the sweepings from the floor found their way into the soil. This was slow alchemy, an endless cycle of giving back just enough to get one more harvest. One more winter survived, and they didn't do it alone. Open fields weren't divided by fences or pride. Strips of land wove together like fabric, your barley beside your neighbor's oats. Everyone planting, harvesting, and resting, fields in sync. It was cooperation disguised as necessity. Shared oxen, shared tools, shared sweat. When a plow broke, half the village helped fix it. When the harvest came, scythes moved like a tide across the landscape, laughter rising with the chaff. It wasn't just community. It was survival protocol. Together, they outsmarted the cold, the hunger, the endless uncertainty. Each furrow, each loaf of bread, each winter night, they owed it all to rhythm and teamwork. Not luck. Look closer at the fields, and you'll see partnerships everywhere. Tall crops offer shelter, low ones guard the soil, and herbs perfume the air to confuse the pests. Beans climb the sturdy stalks of barley or rye, fixing invisible nitrogen treasures below, while grains reach for light above. Onions, garlic, and leek stand as sharp-scented sentinels between rows, warding off insects before they bite. Peas, cabbages, and herbs turn each patch into a quiet alliance of flavors and defenses. It's not superstition, it's pattern. Every leaf has a job, every root a partner. You place shade beside thirst, deep roots beside shallow, fragrance beside fruit. One bed shelters another, and the result is balance. Less disease, fuller baskets. Richer soil. Animals fit neatly into that system. 2. Sheep nibble, stubble, and leave gold in their wake. Pigs till the orchard floor, nosing up acorns and aerating the earth. Cattle tread the rough ground and drop tomorrow's fertilizer with every step. Chickens patrol for grubs, scratching problems out before they start. It's a closed loop of energy and effort, nothing wasted, everything reused. You move herds and flocks like chess pieces, never lingering too long. letting each pasture rest. In return, they give wool, milk, leather, and warmth. It's a contract older than ink. You feed them, they feed you. And together you keep the wheel of life turning through another unforgiving season. Eyes up. The sky is a calendar if you know how to read it. A ring around the moon warns of rain. High, wispy mare's tails whisper that wind's on its way. The old ones didn't need meteorologists. They had instinct, pattern, and memory. You watched the swallow's flight, felt the air's weight, studied how dew gathered on the grass. Seasons weren't dates on parchment. They were felt through the soles of your boots. You marked saint days not out of piety alone, but because they matched the pulse of the land, when to sow, when to reap, when to let the soil breathe. Calendars, carved in wood, hung by the hearth, ticked time not by months but by chores. Each cycle of moonlight and frost, each return of migrating birds, turned life into rhythm instead of guesswork. Seed was knowledge made tangible. You saved the grain that had stood tall against storms, the peas that filled out, even in poor years, the barley that ripened early before the frost's reach. In those sacks were generations of adaptation. And if you ever doubted your own luck, you walked to the monastery. Behind its stone walls, monks guarded rows of jars labeled in calm, careful script, each one a genetic insurance policy. Their gardens were living libraries, their ledgers the memory of harvests, stretching back centuries. You traded your best for theirs, planting hope, one kernel at a time. But even the best seed can't thrive without vigilance. Crows and mice, beetles and caterpillars, they were the other army on the field. Peasants met them with cleverness, not chemicals. A scarecrow here, a bell string there, a child's shout rising from the edge of the furrow. Trap crops lured the worst offenders away, while herbs like mint and tansy masked the smell of what mattered most. They timed their sowing to outpace hatching cycles, broke pest routines with rotation, and welcomed allies like toads, birds, and ladybugs as fellow soldiers. You don't fight Nietzsche, you recruit it. That's how the poorest farmers in Europe outlasted the coldest centuries. By reading the sky, feeding the soil, sharing the load, and building a system so alive it could endure long after its builders were gone. And that's the secret thread, tying it all together. Rhythm. Every action, every ritual, every innovation, worked because it fit into a living pattern that didn't waste a heartbeat. The earth rested when it needed to. Water flowed where it should. Fire burned just enough, and nothing stood alone. The field talked to the forest. The stream answered the plow. The cow fed the crop that would feed the cow again. Even the smoke from the hearth found a second life, curling through rafters to dry herbs and cure meat. Peasants didn't think in terms of efficiency or sustainability, but they lived both. Waste was sin, patience was currency, and knowledge was passed hand to hand, like seed grain tested, refined, never hoarded. The rhythm was bigger than survival. It was culture. Songs kept time for harvest swings, prayers aligned with sowing. Moons and markets pulsed with the same tempo as planting seasons. Every gesture, from mending a thatch roof to flipping a furrow, was part of a choreography that turned bare necessity into art. That's why they outlasted kings, famines, and frozen rivers. The system they built wasn't written in laws or etched on stone, it was grown into the soil itself. When the frost came, they leaned closer to the fire. When the fire died, they lit it again. The little ice age tested every habit, every heartbeat, but the peasants had already woven resilience into their bones. They didn't conquer winter. They learned its steps, and by the time the thaw returned, they'd proved a quiet truth. Intelligence, cooperation, and rhythm beat wealth every single time. And when spring finally cracked the grip of ice, the world those peasants had kept alive began to stir again. Meltwater sang through the ditches they'd carved months before, flooding meadows that would soon green into pasture. The air smelled of smoke and thawing earth, of manure heaps waking with steam and promise. Seeds saved from the last good season came out of hiding fistfuls of future sown, into damp furrows still lined with frost. Children chased the first lambs. Women spread ash and straw where snow had lingered. Every motion was muscle memory, practiced hope. The rhythm of work shifted gears. Plows bit deeper, wheels creaked louder, and hands toughened under the new sun. Oxen leaned into the traces like they knew the stakes because they did. The village beat its steady drum again. Bells at dawn, laughter in the lanes, water wheels turning grain to flour, and smoke rising from 100 hearths. For a few months, the world felt generous. Food was not yet plenty, but it was promise, and that was enough. Still, no one forgot winter's bite. Every fire laid was planned, every loaf divided, every tool repaired before dusk. You learned not to waste warmth or trust chance. You built your resilience in layers of habit, of soil, of kindness. And when the wind came cold again, as it always did, you faced it with the same quiet confidence your ancestors had earned the hard way. That's the real legacy of the medieval peasant, not castles or crowns, but the simple, unshakable knowledge that even the smallest hands can keep the world alive when everything else freezes. When the thaw finally settled for good, it didn't announce itself with trumpets or sunlight. It arrived in silence, mud replacing ice, trickles replacing cracks, and fields breathing steam, as if the earth itself sighed in relief. Villages across Europe blinked into motion, not because anyone told them the cold was over, but because habit had trained them to read the smallest signs. The first green shoots of rye, the way a stream loosened its edges, the sudden weight of scent in the air, soil, smoke, manure, and hope blended into one ancient perfume. Peasants were not fools dreaming of warmth. They were strategists of change. The same hands that had braced through blizzards now loosened ropes on mill wheels and turned frozen earth into furrows again. Each spring felt like a rescue, but it was also a test. A thaw could mean flood as easily as fortune. Rivers, swollen from melted snow, rolled like unleashed beasts through valleys, swallowing fences, barns, and memory. Yet even that destruction had its rhythm. The silt those floods left behind was treasure-rich, dark, heavy with nutrients the soil had missed. The peasant I learned to see not disaster, but investment. Every drowned meadow was next year's bread. By now, centuries of winters had carved wisdom into the bones of Europe's villages. What looked like tradition was often data, memorized through generations. They didn't need parchment or ink. Their archive was muscle memory. The village elder who watched the clouds could tell rain from ruin. The woman kneading dough at dawn knew from the yeast's rise whether the air would turn damp or dry. Every craft had its rhythm, every rhythm its keeper. As the thaws grew longer, something subtle shifted. The hunger for survival turned into curiosity. People began to test, adjust, and reimagine the old routines. The open field system remained, but its tempo changed. Instead of resting 1/3 of their land, some bold farmers began experimenting, sowing quick crops in fallow soil, feeding livestock differently, mixing clover and ryegrass to return fertility faster. It wasn't innovation for its own sake. It was insurance. If another frost came, they wanted more than prayer between them and hunger. You could trace this quiet revolution by listening. 100 years earlier, winter nights were filled with the crack of wood and the low murmur of families huddled close. Now, you'd hear new sounds: looms creaking, hammers shaping iron, water wheels thundering louder. Work diversified. If the field failed, the cottage still produced wool, cloth, tools, pottery. The medieval peasant was turning into something else: part farmer, part craftsman, part entrepreneur before the word existed. With this change came a new kind of interdependence. Villages no longer survived alone. They formed threads in a continental web. What one lacked, another provided. Salt from the coasts, iron from the hills, wool from the valleys, all moving on the backs of carts, barges, and boots. Fairs blossomed like temporary cities, gathering hundreds of people who shared more than goods. They traded news, techniques, and ideas. A farmer from Flanders might return home with a new plow design from the Rhineland. A mason from Brittany might teach a millwright in Saxony how to brace a wheel against floods. Every handshake, every story over ale, stitched Europe tighter. And through it all, the seasons still ruled. Spring called for plowing. Summer demanded sweat. Autumn measured what fortune had allowed. And winter, the old enemy, remained a teacher. But now the peasants met it with more than endurance. They had built tools of foresight. The barns grew taller, the granaries deeper. Smokehouses lined the edges of villages, storing hams, sausages, and saltfish through the bitter months. Cellars expanded, cool and dry, filled with barrels of ale and roots packed in sand. Every improvement was small, almost invisible, but together they turned survival into stability. Even their homes evolved. The same low ceilings and thick walls remained, but timber frames grew stronger, roofs steeper to shed snow faster. Windows fitted tighter with oiled linen or, for the lucky, tiny panes of horn or glass. Hearths moved from the center of the floor to one wall, fitted with crude chimneys that carried smoke upward instead of sideways. The air cleared. Families could see each other without the haze of soot between them. Comfort didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in, one brick, one beam, one breath of cleaner air at a time. Religion, too, bent with the wind. The church had always been a presence, a scaffolding around the peasant year. But as the worst cold eased, faith shifted from desperation to gratitude. Instead of begging for survival, sermons praised adaptation. The idea of divine punishment gave way to divine partnership, the sense that God helped those who helped themselves. Monasteries became not just places of prayer, but laboratories of agriculture. Monks tested crop rotations, recorded rainfall, and kept seed ledgers that read like prophecies. Pilgrims once sought relics, now some sought recipes for living. In the fields, the results were visible. Yields crept higher, livestock grew heavier. Horses, once a noble luxury, became more common among the middle peasants. Their padded collars and iron shoes turned brute strength into elegant efficiency. A team of 2 could plow what once took 4 oxen. And where the horse went, speed followed faster transport, fresher trade, better timing between sowing and reaping. In villages near rivers, barges became floating warehouses, carrying grain downstream while the water still ran fast from the spring melt. Winter, for the first time in memory, stopped being an absolute threat. It was still cold, still cruel, but it was predictable. Firewood was gathered early, peat stacked high, fodder stored for animals months ahead. The family bed still crowded with bodies and pets, but now blankets of spun wool and cured hides replaced raw straw. You could feel the difference, not in luxury, but in confidence. People began to plan beyond one season. Children learned trades their parents had only envied. The concept of next year began to matter in a new way. That mindset was revolutionary. Hope, for peasants, had always been a fragile, conditional, borrowed, easily broken. Now it became infrastructure. Every fence, every millstone, every improved harness whispered the same defiance. We will not be erased by winter. When new cold waves swept through Europe in later centuries, they hit a population no longer fragile, but fortified. Villages rebuilt faster, fields recovered sooner, and fewer starved. The Little Ice Age had tried to thin humanity. Instead, it had tempered it. From that endurance, a subtle kind of wealth emerged. Not the gold of kings or merchants, but the wealth of consistency. Generations could finally pass down more than stories. They could pass down property, tools, skills. The son who inherited his father's plow might also inherit the knowledge of how to fix it. The daughter who learned her mother's spinning rhythm could barter cloth for grain. Households began to accumulate modest surpluses, and with surplus came choice. Some rented extra land, some hired labor, some sent children to towns for apprenticeships. The medieval village, once trapped in a survival loop, was now feeding the growth of cities, and cities, in turn, fed curiosity. What began as a few peasants testing new rotations turned into guilds of specialists, carpenters, smiths, weavers, guarding and refining their craft. Knowledge that once traveled by rumor now moved through written manuals and shared apprenticeships. The plow that once carved one narrow furrow now had cousins adapted for sand, clay, or peat. Mills that once ground only grain began to full cloth, crush seed for oil, saw lumber. Every wheel turned by water multiplied purpose. Peasants didn't call this progress. They called it necessity. But the ripple effect was enormous. The same ingenuity that had saved them from starvation now fueled an agricultural revolution, centuries before anyone gave it a name. Productivity rose, trade expanded, and populations rebounded. Yet at the human level, it still came down to the same small things. The smell of freshly turned soil, the warmth of a shared hearth, the knowledge that tomorrow might not be worse than today. Even art and language began to change under this quiet prosperity. Songs about famine shifted into songs about labor and harvest. Proverbs that once warned of scarcity started praising diligence and cleverness. As you sow, so shall you reap wasn't just a moral, it was a plan. Storytellers recited ballads of blacksmiths and millers instead of only knights and saints. The peasant, long ignored, became the quiet hero of his own tale. But the true genius of those centuries was invisible. It was hidden in routine, disguised as normality. The peasants who repaired dikes, who rebuilt after floods, who shared their grain with a neighbor whose barn had burned those acts, wrote the blueprint for the modern world. Cooperation over competition, sustainability over speed, adaptation over defiance. They didn't conquer nature. They negotiated with it. And the deal they struck was simple. Give back what you take, and you might just endure. Even in the coldest corners of Europe, this new rhythm reached. In the Scandinavian valleys, farmers learned to terrace their hillsides, catching the sun and trapping warmth in layers of stone. In the alpine villages, hay barns rose on stilts to keep the mice out and the air circulating. In the Low Countries, windmills joined the chorus beside water wheels, reclaiming land from the sea, with the same stubborn patience peasants had once used to reclaim life from the frost. Everywhere, technology met tradition, not as rivals, but as partners. Travelers began to notice. Chroniclers wrote about villages that never sleep, about fields that sing with order. To them, it seemed miraculous that people of so few means could achieve such harmony. But it wasn't miracle. It was memory. The same discipline that had built a fire pit in the center of a cottage now built canals, barns, and mills. The same instinct that had taught families to huddle for warmth now taught them to unite for profit, safety, and pride. And still, each winter tested that system anew. Some years the frost returned early, hard and merciless. Some summers failed altogether, but the peasants didn't panic. They adapted, redistributing stores, shifting planting times, tightening belts together. They had built resilience into every layer of their lives, in architecture, in diet, in the way they trusted one another. No noble decree or papal blessing could replace that strength. By the 15th century, the children of those who'd once nearly frozen to death were building cathedrals, universities, and marketplaces that glowed with light and color. Behind every merchant's ledger and scholar's manuscript was a field that had learned to live through the dark. The Little Ice Age had birthed a quiet kind of genius, practical, patient, and fiercely communal. It didn't just survive, it transformed survival into civilization. When you trace history's grand arcs, Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, it's easy to see only kings, artists, and explorers. But beneath them all ran the same pulse, steady as a mill wheel. The rhythm of peasants who refused to surrender to the cold. They built the infrastructure of resilience, brick by brick, generation by generation. They taught the continent how to bend without breaking. The iron in their plows became the steel of cities. The networks of their fields became the grids of nations. The wisdom of their hearths became the first spark of experimentation, adaptation. And through it all, their story remained the same simple truth, whispered by every thawing stream. Warmth is not given, it's made. It's earned through endurance, shared through community, and preserved by the memory of cold. That's how the poorest people in history ended up shaping the foundations of the modern world, by outlasting the frost. One fire, one seed, one heartbeat at a time. Perfect. I'll continue straight from part 8. Same cinematic rhythm, immersive, historical, emotional, carrying the story forward into the next evolution. How the descendants of those resilient peasants slowly transformed Europe from survival farming into innovation, community guilds, windmills, and the first signs of a modern world emerging from the frost. When the frost returned the next winter, it met a different kind of Europe. The peasants who had once huddled beside open hearths and prayed for mercy now faced the cold with confidence, even purpose. They'd built systems from instinct, turning hardship into education. And that quiet intelligence began to spread beyond the village. Across valleys and hills, the habits of survival became habits of progress. You could hear it first, not in the wind or the creak of timber, but in rhythm, hammers at the forge, the whir of a mill wheel, the measured chop of axes in a managed woodland. What had once been reaction, scraping by against frost and famine, was turning into method. Fields were no longer just patches of subsistence. They were experiments. A village that had once waited for spring now anticipated it, like an engineer planning a season's blueprint. Wind joined water as an ally. The first windmills rose on ridgelines, timber towers creaking against the pale sky. At first, they looked alien, strange silhouettes above the hedges, but they worked. Where rivers froze, wind kept turning. It ground grain, pumped water, even sawed wood when fitted with new gears. The peasants didn't call it progress. They called it practicality. Every hour of labor saved was another hour to tend the animals. Men tools, or simply rest. The wheel, the wind, and the water together made a kind of invisible workforce. Quiet and tireless. The miller became a new kind of figure in village life. Half craftsman, half magician. His machines clattered with motion few fully understood, yet everyone depended on them. The sound of the mill wheel was like a heartbeat. On still days, when the sails hung limp or the stream ran low, silence felt dangerous, as though the world itself had paused. Around those mills and forges, a new culture of collaboration emerged. The same peasants who once huddled together for warmth now gathered for trade. The old open field system still held, but within it were sparks of entrepreneurship. Bakers, smiths, coopers, weavers, every small skill became a node in a growing web of interdependence. Labor wasn't just survival anymore. It was beginning to specialize. Even the houses began to change. Stone replaced wattle and daub, where people could afford it. Roofs grew steeper to shed snow. windows teeny, and covered in oiled parchment let in light, without letting in the storm. Cottages began to cluster around central greens, forming patterns that hinted at planning, and at their edges, workshops sprouted, like mushrooms after rain. Knowledge, once the domain of monasteries, began to seep outward. Monks still kept their ledgers of weather and seed yields, but travelers, peddlers, pilgrims, and wandering craftsmen carried those ideas down the roads, spreading innovation like pollen. One village learned to build a stronger plowshare. Another discovered how to cure wood against rot. A third figured out that mixing lime into walls kept moisture at bay. Each lesson spread quietly, one conversation at a time. Europe's rebirth wasn't written in proclamations. It was whispered over ale, exchanged beside fires, demonstrated in the dirt. And the rhythm of the seasons kept marking the tempo of change. Spring brought not just planting, but planning. New rotations tested, new grains tried. Rye joined wheat, barley shared space with oats, and beans filled in the hungry months when bread ran low. Fields that once slept idle began to yield clover and vetch, fixing nitrogen into soil long thought spent. Peasants didn't know the science, but they knew the science: darker soil, fuller heads, fewer weeds. Summer's heat was still a test of endurance, but the tools had improved. Iron sickles replaced bronze, scythes grew longer and cleaner. Wooden handles were polished smooth by generations of hands, shaped perfectly to the grip. The efficiency that came from such refinement wasn't accidental, it was evolution through need. A broken blade in harvest time could mean starvation. A well-made one could feed an entire household through winter. Autumn remained sacred. The great reckoning between what had been sown and what could be spared. Granaries became sturdier, barns larger. The communal spirit never faded, but the sense of individual pride in craft grew stronger. A man could point to a well-made plow and say, "I built that." A woman could lift a bolt of woven wool and say, "I made this." Survival had given birth to mastery, and winter still came, sharp as ever, but it found a people who had learned to meet it on equal terms. The hearth still burned, but now its smoke curled through chimneys carefully shaped for draw. Floors layered with rushes gave way to wooden planks where timber was cheap enough. Blankets grew thicker, candles burned longer. Glass appeared in the homes of the wealthier farmers. The nights were still long, but not hopeless. Music filled them, and stories more confident now, less haunted. What was once fear had turned into foresight. Whole communities began to plan across generations. Fathers taught sons not only how to plow, but how to repair the plow, how to select the right wood for the handle, how to temper iron so it didn't snap. Daughters learned not just to spin, but to dye, to trade, to keep accounts. Survival was now skill, and skill was value. Across Europe, this quiet transformation rippled outward. The monasteries noticed it first, grain deliveries more consistent, tax payments steadier, fewer desperate families at the gate. Lords noticed it, next fields yielding more, tenants defaulting less, and cities, small and scattered, began to grow fat on the excess. Surplus changed everything. Where there was more than enough, there was trade. Where there was trade, there was connection. Markets became the new gatherings. Peasants who once measured wealth by the depth of their larder, now measured it in cloth, tools, salt, and spices. The air in those markets was thick with barter grain for iron, wool for saltfish, candles for ale. Languages mixed, accents tangled, and the slow hum of commerce began to replace the silence of isolation. And behind it all, still, was the same rhythm of labor, and weather, the pulse that had never failed them. They hadn't abandoned the old ways. They'd refined them. Compost heaps were managed with purpose now, turned and layered by schedule. Herds were rotated to rest pastures systematically. Ditches and levees were repaired before the floods came, not after. For every risk that once brought disaster, there was now a precaution. It wasn't science yet, but it was reason born of lived experience, and the relentless need to survive better next time. By the late 14th century, windmills dotted entire coastlines. Water wheels powered trip hammers and bellows, feeding small foundries that could make better tools. Smiths began to trade not just metal, but design. A better hinge, a stronger nail, a plow that cut cleaner. These were currency, as valuable as coin. The medieval peasant, once anonymous, was becoming an artisan in all but name. And as tools improved, so did time. With fewer hours lost to sheer struggle, minds began to wander. You could see it in the marginal doodles of monks, in the decorative carvings on plow handles, in the painted saints on cottage walls. The same hands that had once fought frost and famine now found moments to create beauty. It wasn't idleness. It was abundance turned inward. The landscape itself bore witness. Forests that had once been stripped bare were now managed, copied, and cut in careful cycles. Fields were laid out with precision, hedges planted for windbreaks and soil retention. Even rivers were tamed, redirected, bridged, and used for transport. Every feature of the land became a tool in the human arsenal, against chance. And beneath that rising order, something ancient still pulsed. The same humility before nature, the same respect for rhythm. Farmers still watched the moon, still marked the solstice, still left offerings at boundary stones just in case. Progress hadn't erased faith, it had tempered it. Humanity no longer saw itself as helpless under heaven, but as a partner in the grand design. Villages that once felt small began to look outward. Trade routes extended. Pilgrimages carried news. Fairs linked far-flung regions. From Bruges to Florence, from York to Krakow, the pulse of trade tied hands that would never meet. Cloth made in one valley ended up in another kingdom. Salt mined from distant coasts flavored bread in mountain villages. The web thickened, invisible but unbreakable, by the time the next generations came of age. The peasants of the Little Ice Age were no longer the same species of humanity that had first faced it. They had reinvented themselves. The tools of endurance had become the tools of creation. The same ingenuity that once kept a cottage warm now powered windmills, built cathedrals, and planned canals. Survival had evolved into civilization, and still, in every field, the lesson lingered. The fire that once smoked under a thatched roof became the forge that shaped iron wheels. The dung heap that once stank beside the cottage became compost, then chemistry. The shared bed that kept 6 people alive through a blizzard became the metaphor for community itself. Together, or not at all. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the descendants of those frost-bitten families were standing on a foundation built entirely by their ancestors' quiet genius. They had learned to read the sky and the soil like scripture. They had made peace with hardship, then turned it into wisdom. And that wisdom, multiplied by trade, by craft, by connection, became the spark that would ignite the modern world. Europe didn't rise because of kings or crusades. It rose because peasants refused to die. Because they watched, listened, adapted, and remembered. Every furrow cut through frost. Every loaf shared in famine. Every patch mended by firelight carried a code, a manual for survival disguised as tradition. When the ice came, they endured. When it thawed, they built. And when they finally looked up and saw the sails of windmills turning in the dawn, they understood they had conquered nothing. They had simply learned how to live perfectly with everything.